Hey everybody, this is Linda and I have a project to share with you. I've been working on this book for a couple weeks and I finished it, so I wanted to show it to you. This is my Romeo and Juliet fabric book. I love Romeo and Juliet, and especially the movie that was made in 1968 with Olivia Hussey and Leonard Whiting. So the images that I used are from that particular Romeo and Juliet movie. So anyway, this is it. I think I got it all in frame. I used a ton of doilies, a lot of vintage ones that I had for a while. I pretty much cleaned out my vintage stash of doilies on this book. Um, anyway, I started out with I think I showed you in one of my other videos the way that I was doing the base of this book. I did gussets and I wasn't sure it was going to work out, but it did. I love it, and I'll probably use that technique from now on. I left about, I think it was like a half an inch in between each of my pages, and it made my book lay quite flat, which is what I wanted, rather than, one side, down here and the other one up here. So I have a nice thick spine on it. And anyway, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the things I used because all of them were from my stash, and I just layered a bunch of doilies, and this trim is really only some yarn, and I used it a lot in my book because I don't know, I just like it, and I used a lot of that. You'll see. I used some seam binding and made a real crinkled up bow, and used some dangles trim here on the edge. I made this little flower just by winding up some cheesecloth, two different colors, and one was avocado dyed and the other was tea dyed, and just stuck them down with a little button in them, or a little one of these little, well, I'll show them to you when I get to them. There's some little trim with some little balls on it, and I just stuck one of those little balls in there. I used a piece of a curtain down here and used some appliques from a dress that I got at the thrift store a few weeks ago. It was a pink dress. So these are kind of a pale pink flower. And I just wanted to have a little pink on there, and I have this little piece of ribbon up here, that, or lace up here, that has a little pink and blue flowers on it. And this was just an old doily I had, and I just laid it, wrapped it around, and it was a pretty good fit. So anyway, that's then I have a piece of trim over here that I cut off of an old doily. For the spine, I used a piece of trim. Actually, I used two pieces, one on each side, and I kind of just laced up a piece of lace that I cut off of a remnant that I had, and that's all I put on there. I didn't want a lot of dangles hanging down, so I didn't put any. And then this is the back, and it just has that rest of this doily here, and my tag, excuse me. And so that is it. I used, this is a piece of that doily, and then I used, this is on the other side, so I'll show you that when I turn the book. So and my first image has Romeo and Juliet written right here. I think you can see that. And so anyway, my first page on the inside is the Romeo and Juliet, the prologue to to the movie. And actually, it's to the story, I suppose, or the play that Shakespeare wrote. But it says, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove. Okay, and then it says, and now the 2 hours traffic of our stage, the which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss our toil shall strive to mend. And so anyway, that is what I used for the first page. And I just went around it with some cheesecloth, some eyelet trim that I dyed. I think it was tea dye. Some of this is coffee dyed, but I can't remember which is which. This is another old doily that I used, and there's another piece of one here and over here on this side. Up here, I stretched the cheesecloth out, and then I laid this metal embellishment here with the flower that I've had forever. I don't have a clue where it came from, but I finally decided to use it on this. And then I used some small 10 millimeter two-tone. Now this is the 10 millimeter two-tone pink and ivory open rose, and this is the 15 millimeter rose buds, I think they are. And then I use some little leaves. Anyway, that's the first page. Then I used some of that yarn here in the gusset. And then on this page I used some of the trim from the dress I got a few weeks ago. I used some lace back here. I think you can see that. This was a piece of an applique from a vintage dress that I bought at a yard sale. I forget where this came from, but I really like that. And it's a stretchy lace trim, but it works well there. And then I used some more of the eyelet that I used over here. And then here you can see a little bit of this lace that's down here on the bottom. I left it. And then I used some doily trim here that I cut off of a doily. One of those doilies that have the gathers around the edges of it. And then I used another another trim here, another dangle trim. Ooh, I got a lot of glue strings. Sorry. Get those off. Yeah, so that's that page. And it says, if I profane with my unworthy hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this, my lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a kiss. Now, this particular image is from when Romeo and Juliet met at the ball. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Those of you who do know may just want to skip over this, but the Capulets and the Montagues were enemies. They hated one another. And the prince had warned them that the next time they disturbed the peace in the town square, that with their feuding, that someone would pay with their life. So the Count of Paris wanted to marry Juliet, and her father had a masquerade ball so that they could, I guess, meet or whatever. And so some of the young Montague boys, who was Romeo's family, they snuck in, as you know, teenage boys are going to do. They snuck into the ball of their mortal enemy, the Capulets. And Romeo saw Juliet, and she saw him. And anyway, they had this dance where you use your hands. So after that dance was over and another one started, they kind of followed each other until they both got to the same spot. And so they're having this little discussion about hands and how if hands do this, then, you know, why can't lips do this? But anyway, that's this picture when they're discussing how hands touch and so forth and so on. So anyway, as we go to the next page, this is after the ball is over, and Romeo does not leave. He sneaks over the wall and is staring up at the balcony. And Juliet comes out on the balcony, and anyway, she says things, you know, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? And he jumps out of the bushes and says, I'm here, I'm here. Anyway, so he scurries up a tree and up to the balcony, and this is one of the scenes from the balcony. And on this page, I made this pink. This is avocado dyed here, and all of these pink things are avocado dyed. And this is another flower that I made by just rolling up some cheesecloth. This is the trim that I avocado dyed, and this is just a little Chinese trim, Chinese braid trim, I guess that's what you call it, that I think came from Hobby Lobby. I made these little flowers from some pieces of the old vintage dress that I got from the thrift yard sale, and I cut these tiny flowers here from appliques on a wedding dress. And I backed the picture with a doily, and then used some little real tiny gathered lace, and then some pearl flat back trim along the edge of that. On the flower, I used a little bit of eyelash trim, a doily connector, and a little flower, and I don't know where that came from. And then I used some of this dangle trim here and added some pearls to those flowers. And that is that page. And over here is another picture from the balcony scene, where they're talking and discussing what's in a name. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So we've all heard that little quote before, I think. And these are both appliques from the vintage dress that I got from the thrift store, as well as these little flowers here that I've put these I just cut these from the trim there, from that same trim, and put in the center of those. I used some buttons from that same dress down the side here, which all these pieces of applique from that dress they've all been avocado dyed or coffee dyed or tea dyed. So I did a variety of all those different colors. And the trim I used on here was from an old curtain. I put some flat back pearls here in the center of each of the flowers. And I used some cheesecloth on here. Actually, I laid the whole piece down, this cheesecloth, behind the picture. And I let some of it just hang out all the way around. And then I used some of this little fringe trim here, and underneath that I used another dangle trim. And this was a vintage trim here that I got from a lady that used to have an antique store, and it was a lace and fabric store, and this came from where she was getting rid of all of her stuff. And so that's that page. And then we come over on this page, and this is just portraits of Romeo and Juliet, and I used a piece of silk, or not silk, but lace. I think it might have been a dress. And I just laid that down, and I didn't put anything here. This is the middle of the book, so I left that just because it's the the middle, and I wanted the page to be all the way across. So anyway, here are the portraits of Romeo and Juliet. I used some avocado dyed flowers from an applique, and behind each picture I used a doily, and then I had these little, what do you want to call them? They're not appliques, and they really aren't doilies, but they were just little oval things, and they had a little bit of netting in the middle, and I cut that netting out, and I used those to frame their pictures. This was just some crochet trim I had in my stash that more than likely came from either Walmart or Hobby Lobby, since everything usually pretty much comes from there. This was some more of the dangle trim. I put flat back pearls in the centers of all the flowers. And then over here I used a doily, and I cut the center out of it and used it as a frame for this picture. And then I put flat back pearls, and I used little clay flowers all around. And then here was a piece of a center of a doily on top of another little doily, and I used a little 10mm rose from Wild Orchid Crafts. And then here's just some dangles, and I made these dangles myself, and I just put those there. And this says, good night, parting is such sweet sorrow. So overnight, just in that little while that they were on the balcony together, they professed their love to one another and decided that they would get married. Talk about a quick romance. They had one. So the next day, Juliet sent her nurse, nanny, whatever you want to call her, to the church where she met Romeo. And Romeo told her to tell Juliet when to be at the church so that they could get married. And I guess that they were thinking this would probably stop the feud. So anyway, Friar Lawrence, he marries them. And this says, but my true love has grown to such excess, I cannot sum up half my wealth. And I used another piece of cheesecloth. I used a lot of cheesecloth in this book too. The avocado dyed cheesecloth with some bell trim here, and appliques from a wedding dress, and from several different wedding dresses. And I did not put any more dangles down. I just left, because you could see those others, and I just left them, and you can see the cheesecloth here. So anyway, as we move along, in between the wedding and the wedding night, Romeo tries to make peace with the young men of the Capulets, which is Juliet's family. And he actually comes upon kind of a tussle going on in the square where they're not supposed to be feuding, so to speak. And he tries to be nice to Tybalt, which is, I'm going to say, Juliet's cousin, although I really don't know who he was. I just know he was a Capulet. And when Romeo comes in to this particular thing going on, Mercutio, however you want to say it, which I'm going to say is Romeo's cousin, is they're bickering back and forth, and Romeo tries to make peace. And anyway, in all of this, there's a scuffle, and Tybalt kills Mercutio with his sword. And this just, Romeo just loses it. And he can't deal with what's happened. And he goes after Tybalt, and they fight, and Romeo kills him. Well, the prince had already said that if there was any more bloodshed, that somebody's life, they were going to pay with their lives. So Romeo, he's all distraught because he's really not a fighter. He's really very like a daydreamer or something. So anyway, he runs to Friar Lawrence and doesn't know what to do. Word spreads, and Juliet finds out, and it's just a big to-do. And so Friar Lawrence comes up with this plan for Romeo to disappear until he can smooth things over. And so Romeo has one night to spend with his bride, and then early in the morning he has to leave before they find him. So this is where he sneaks in. He sneaks in to Juliet's room, and they spend their wedding night together. And the next morning, Romeo wakes up early, and Juliet's telling him, it's not time to get up. It's not morning yet. And he says it is, and she says it's not. And anyway, he says, night's candles are burnt out, and Jonkin Day stands tiptoe on the mountain tops. I must be gone and live, or stay and die. So he's leaving, and they think it's just until Friar Lawrence gets things under control. But so anyway, I'll tell you about this page, and then we'll go on with the story for those of you who don't know. So on this page, I use some braided, that bell braid trim. I used this I cut off of a garment, and I don't know what it was. I think it could have been a shirt of some sort. But it was a big long piece, and I cut this little bit off and used down here on the bottom, and it has this little trim across it, across the bottom of it. So I used that there. I used a piece of an applique up here on the top. I used some appliques there, and then I just used this trim around the edges here. And up here I put a piece of a curtain and then the flower on top of that, if that makes any sense. And again, I have the cheesecloth. And I put some more of this crocheted dangle down here on the bottom of this. And this, I've already read that. So as we turn over, Romeo's gone now. He's left. And Juliet is very, very upset when she finds out that her father wants her to marry this prince that showed up. The Count of Paris, I think, is actually his proper title. Anyway, she pitches a fit, says no. She gets, she runs to Friar Lawrence. They always run to him with every problem they have. So they come up with a scheme that Juliet's going to take this sleeping potion. So that night she takes, and in the meantime, as she takes this sleeping potion, Friar Lawrence is going to send a message to Romeo, and he's going to send a message to Romeo, and he's going to tell him that she's just going to pretend to be sleeping. She's not going to be. I mean, she's going to hang on a second. I'm going to get this out in a minute. Got my tongue all twisted up. Anyway, Juliet's supposed to take this potion, and it's going to make her look as if she's dead. Well, Friar Lawrence doesn't want Romeo to hear that she's dead, so he writes a letter and sends it by mail, which is a donkey, a man leading a donkey, sends him to Verona, which is where Romeo's at now. And so in the meantime, Juliet goes back. She makes peace with her father, says he wants to know where she's been. She said she's been to church and that everything is good and she'll do what he says, all the time knowing she's not going to do that. But that's what she tells him, get him off her back. So that night, after everybody goes to bed, she takes this potion, goes to sleep, looks like she's dead. The nurse finds her the next morning, and they are very quick to bury her. They don't mess around about burying people. So they have their ceremony, and they lay her out in the tomb, the Capulets tomb, or whatever they called it back then. I don't know. They called it something. Anyway, it's just like big old steel pieces of rock or something. Big square with. Anyway, they laid her on there. So Romeo's little, I don't know if he was his cousin or just a friend or what. He was a little young guy. He hears about Juliet being dead, and he runs, gets on his horse, and goes to Verona as fast as he can go to let Romeo know that Juliet's dead. Well, the mail hadn't gotten there yet. Well, Romeo, he hightails it back, and he breaks in or goes into the shrine there where Juliet's laying. And he sees her, and he's so heartbroken, and he can't live without her. And he doesn't know that she's not dead. So he has some poison of his own. So he takes the poison. He dies. Then Juliet wakes up. She sees that he's dead. And so she stabs herself with his knife and kills herself. And that's where we're at here. They're laid out side by side in another ceremony after everybody finds out that, they were married and whatever. So this is them laid out in their burial clothes. And the prince comes out and says, and that's over here, a gloomy peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these and things. Some shall be pardoned for Never there was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. And that doesn't say pardon. I missed a spot. So I'm going to read the whole thing again because this is a blooper. So you get my blooper in here. A gloomy peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. And that's the story of Romeo and Juliet, as I tell it, which may or may not be exactly right, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So anyway, on this page, which is the last two pages, I used a very thin piece of fabric from some type of a table scarf. And here is some crochet trim up here around the edge of there. I used some more of those little rosebuds and a few open roses, and I forget what color that is, and some leaves. Rolled up a piece of cheesecloth here, and you put a flat back pearl in it. Down here I used a piece of a curtain and a little doily and a little pearl. Over here is another. This is a sweetheart. This is a sweetheart blossom, I think, from Wild Orchid Crafts, and I just used some trim I had laying there. I just put it together and made a little embellishment. And I used different kinds of trim from some doilies around the edge, and I used this little trim here that came off of a scarf. And then here's another doily, and I put cheesecloth around here, and then I used some of that same yarn there. And then on the last page, I used a piece of a doily and another piece of a doily and a flower from Wild Orchid Crafts, a rose. I used that elastic trim here, another flower made from cheesecloth, and a doily connector. And then I just rolled a piece of some type of fabric that I had. I think it was just a piece of muslin that I had avocado dyed. And then I used a little button in the center there. This is some more of that vintage applique from that old dress I got. And I put some dangles down here. For these dangles, I used that yarn, and I tore strips of muslin and used that. So that is the end of my book. Hope you enjoyed looking at it and hearing my story, as messed up as I could get at some points. But anyway, that's my project, and I love it. I think it turned out really, really good. I don't normally think my work is very good. Some people have asked me if I would, consider selling some of it, and I don't really think it's good enough to sell. And even if I thought it was, I wouldn't have a clue what to charge for it. But anyway, that's it, and I just wanted to share it with you. So thanks everybody that hung around and listened. I hope you weren't too bored, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye for now.